You can start.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to this Growing Up in Scotland webinar. My name is Paul Bradshaw. I'm the Director of the Scottish Centre for Social Research. I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's session. I'm also the lead at ScotSen for the Growing Up in Scotland study, and I'm joined by some of my colleagues on the team today who I'll introduce in due course. Uh, we've only got an hour today and we've got quite a lot to get through. So I'm going to, without further ado, uh, share my slides and get us going. So hopefully you can all see those slides now. So I'm going to just start by giving a little bit of an overview of the background of growing up in Scotland, and then a little bit of specific information on our age 17 or sweep 11 data collection before we then move on to 4 topic presentations delivered by myself and colleagues today on selected topics from the report that was published just a few weeks ago. And then we'll follow those presentations with a response from Donna Easterlow, Head of Children and Families Analysis at Scottish Government, before finishing with hopefully around 20 minutes for Q&A. And you'll have opportunity to submit questions throughout the webinar, and please, and I would encourage you to do so. And you do that through the Q&A function, which you'll find on your Zoom screen. So please put any and all questions in there as we move throughout the day, and I'll continually remind you of that. But let's make a start by just providing a little bit of a background to growing up in Scotland. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the study already. And apologies if you've heard me do this, give you this sort of part of the presentation before. It's not my first rodeo, as they say, certainly not where growing up in Scotland is concerned. So what is growing up in Scotland, or GUS as we call it? Well, it's a large-scale longitudinal birth and child cohort study, which to date has involved 3 national samples of children, or 3 cohorts of children, as we call them, that are shown up there on the slide. So we've got birth cohort 1, so just over 5,000 children, all born in 2004-05, who were aged just over 10 months at their first interview. And at the same time, we launched the child cohort, slightly older group, just under 3,000 children born in 2002-03, who were just under age 3 when we first interviewed them. And then a second birth cohort, we called them birth cohort 2, just over 6,000 children, all born in 2010 or 11, who were similarly aged just over 10 months at their first interview. Growing Up in Scotland is a Scottish Government commissioned survey, and we've been running the project since 2005. And this is how the data collection on the project has proceeded since then across the 3 cohorts. And what you'll notice immediately, if you weren't aware already, is that data collection has focused primarily on birth cohort 1. And that's the cohort findings from whom we're going to be talking about today. So you can see we started data collection with that cohort when they were aged just around 10 months back in 2005-06. And we've just recently, in fact, in the last few weeks, finished our age kind of 1920, our sweep 12 or 12 sweep of face-to-face data collection with them in 2025. And we've annual data collection between birth and age 6, and then data collection since then almost every other year, every 2 to 3 years. So a really comprehensive, rich data set on birth cohort 1, but some comparative data on each of the other cohorts at key time points. So you'll see on the child cohort at ages 3 to 6, and in birth cohort 2 at 10 months, age 3 and age 5. Across that time, the main source of data collection on the study has been the child's main carer, as you can see at the top of the table there. That is usually the child's, has usually been the child's biological mother, but it's not exclusively. And that kind of parent interview was the core part of all of our data collection up until really around age 17, which we're talking about today, where the main data collection switched to the cohort member. But in fact, we've been collecting questionnaire data from the cohort member since they were age 8, as you can see in the third row. And in fact, even before that, from as young as age 2 to 3, the child, the cohort member, has been involved in kind of observational, objective measurement of their cognitive ability and their height and weight. And we've had that consistently from around age 2 up to age 17. And that top half of that table are the data elements that have formed part of our sweeps of data collection that we've tended to do, although not entirely have done in home using face-to-face data collection approaches. But aside from that, we've linked the survey data to a number of administrative data sets, primarily health and education data sets. And as you can see, we've got a full suite of health administrative data available alongside a number of different educational data sets covering the early years, early learning and childcare period through primary school and secondary school. And more recently, I'll say a little bit more about this later, some attainment and post-school destination data. GUS is very much a multidisciplinary study, and it has drawn on policy evidence needs from across government. And whilst there has often been a focus on certain areas around education and perhaps health, we've collected a whole array of additional information that tells us lots about children's complex and differing lives across the population, as shown on the slide here. And I don't have much time to go into that detail today. But what about Sweep 11, the age 17 fieldwork itself? Well, yeah, so cohort members were aged between 17 and 18, mostly aged 17 at the time of data collection. And fieldwork was conducted between the end of 2021 and June 2023 in 2 phases. Now, it's important to note that when we launched data collection in November 2021, there were still COVID-related restrictions on in-home data collection, which meant that we couldn't have our face-to-face interviewers visit young people and their families in their home. So the data was collected, initially at least, through a mix of web and telephone surveys, and then ultimately in phase 2, which started in December 2022, we were able to do those in-home interviews, and they formed the last part of that fieldwork sweep. The data was collected from the cohort member and the parent carer, but most of the data came from the cohort member, and that was a notable change from prior sweeps when the parent had been our primary respondent. And you'll see that reflected in the report and the findings, which are very much focused on data from the cohort member rather than the parent. So we had 2,600 families participated. They gave us some data. Not everyone completed all elements, and in fact that was in large part as a function of our ability to do the data collection in person or remotely, which had some impact on response. So for example, where data collection was in home, we were able to conduct objective height and weight measurements and do cognitive assessments with the young people, but otherwise we weren't able to collect those data. And just as an aside, as part of the age 17 data collection, we collaborated with colleagues at University of Glasgow on the Spaces project to do a follow-up data collection exercise on physical activity and collecting GPS data as part of the Spaces project. And that was a follow-up of some data collection that was done initially at age 10. These are the topics that we collected some information on from the cohort member at age 17. As you can see, a wide range of topics included everything from political attitudes to anti-social behaviour. And we're going to be touching on just some of them this afternoon, but almost all of these are covered in the report. So please do check that out if you haven't done so already. And of course, we collected a more limited set of data from our parents and carers in the study at that sweep. I mentioned some new linked administrative data that has recently become available, and I wanted to do a little bit of a plug for that in case people weren't aware. It's very recently been released, but we can now link the survey data with attainment information from the Scottish Qualifications Authority, and that's for all qualifications that our cohort were presented for up to August 2025, so covers the full set of school education, school qualifications, and some further education qualifications as well. And then from Skills Development Scotland, we've got a set of data on leaver destinations. And so they measure destinations at 3 and 9 months after leaving school. And the most up-to-date point was at the 18th of August when the data was extracted. And that destination data is coded consistently with the Scottish Government reporting on leaver destinations. And you can get all of that via the UKDS, the UK data service, where the rest of the survey data is held. And a quick update on what we're doing now. We've very recently finished our Age 20 Fieldwork Suite 20. This was data collection with our cohort members only. We conducted it using a sequential web CAPI approach, and that means we invited everybody to do a web survey in the first instance, and those who didn't complete a web survey for us, we then followed them up with an interviewer and did an in-home. We've conducted that fieldwork from February to October. We're very pleased with how it's went. Anyone who's familiar will know that collecting data, survey data from 20-year-olds can be quite challenging, even if you've had them involved in a cohort study for 20 years. Again, a comprehensive set of data collected, some examples of the topics, many carried through from recent sweeps there. We've also extended the administrative data linkage to include longitudinal educational outcomes data, and that will give us information from universities and colleges, DWP, HMRC, information about employment, earnings and benefits as the cohort move into adulthood. And all of that data, well, certainly the survey data should be available next year, hopefully in the summer or before, if we can manage it. And if you're interested in any of these data, it is all available. You can find out more information on the GUS website. I've put an address up there, but if you just Google Growing Up in Scotland, you will get that, and there is a dedicated GUS data page, along with information on publications and events and a whole host of other stuff on there. So I would encourage you to look at that afterwards. Okay, without further ado, I want to keep us moving on to the first topic. So we've got 4 topic presentations today. First, we're going to hear from Eleanor Holman, one of the researchers on the team. She'll be talking about education and beyond. Then Lena Knudsen, one of our research directors, will give a brief overview of some findings on social media, followed by Helly Wilson, a senior researcher on the team, who's going to talk about some of the findings we've got on political participation, before I round things off, talking a little about some of the findings on mental health and life satisfaction. So without further ado, Eleanor, please take us forward.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about what young people were doing at age 17 in terms of education, the kind of things they considered when they were choosing what to do after they left school, and sort of what they were hoping for further on in the future as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what we've got here is we asked the young people what they had been doing over the last week, and they could select all of the options that were relevant to them. So we can see that most young people were either working or at school, and around 1 in 5 was at college or university as well. And 10% were sort of waiting to take up a place, whether that's at college or university, at a job, or an apprenticeship or a training program. Next slide, please. And to look at this in a little bit more detail, so we can see there were some differences by area deprivation here. So we can see that those in the least deprived areas were sort of twice as likely as those in the most deprived areas to be in school. And those in least deprived areas were also more likely to be working than those in the most deprived areas. Whereas for college and university, those in the least deprived areas were less likely to be in college or university than those in the most deprived areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of what they considered when thinking about what to do after S4, most young people said that they considered what they enjoy doing and what they're good at as most important. But we can also see that advice from parents was important to 21% of young people as well. Next slide, please. So to look at this in a little bit more detail, we can also see that some of these other factors did have some differences by sex there. So young men were more likely than young women to think it's important to consider which jobs earned the most money and which jobs have work-based learning routes, whereas young women were more likely than young men to consider the importance of which jobs involve helping other people or things that have a positive impact on society. Next slide, please. So we also asked about different aspirations they had for their futures further on in life, and so overall we can see that having a career was very important to young people, and the majority of them also had a clear idea of what career they would want. But we did see some differences by disability here. So disabled young people were less likely than non-disabled young people to agree that having a career was important to them, and to say that they had a clear idea of the career that they would want. And they were also less likely to want to run their own business as well. There were some differences. Oh, sorry, can we go back? Thanks. There were some sex differences here as well. So in terms of the career-related aspirations, so young men were more likely than young women to want to run their own business, and also more likely to say they wouldn't mind not enjoying their work as long as it paid the bills. And we did ask about whether they would want a family as well. So we can see about 2/3 did want to have a family sometime in the future. And there were some differences by sex and disability here as well. So young men were more likely than young women to agree that they would want a family. And similarly, non-disabled young people were more likely than disabled young people to agree that they would want a family in the future as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so what we can see here is the proportion of young people that agreed that they were optimistic about their future. So we can see that most young people, so just under 2/3, did agree that they were optimistic about the future, with young women and disabled young people being slightly less likely to agree than young men and non-disabled young people. And on the right-hand side here, we can also see whether people were more or less optimistic about the future compared to before COVID. So we can see that young women were slightly more likely than young men to say they were less optimistic than before the pandemic. But overall, over 2/3 of young people either felt about the same or more optimistic about the future than before the pandemic. That's me. So that's a good overview of where they were at that point in time. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Eleanor. So as you can see, we're doing a really whistle-stop tour of some of these topics just now. Hopefully they give you a flavour of some of the key insights that the GUS evidence offers. I do encourage you, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A as we go through. So I'm going to invite Lena Knudsen now to give us an overview of our findings related to social media.
Great, thanks, Paul. If you go on to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for this, we first of all wanted to understand how much young people use social media. So we asked them how often they normally check social media or messaging apps on a day where they were at school, training, or work. And as you can see on the chart here, so we've got the figures for all young people at the top and then shown for young men and young women separately. So around a third checked social media messaging apps every half an hour. A similar proportion checked every hour, and then the rest checked them less frequently. And only around 1% said they did not use social media. And what you can also see is that young women checked social media more frequently than young men. And next slide, please. So we also wanted to understand how young people felt about social media and their experiences of using it. So we presented them with 4 statements, and then we asked them to what extent they agreed or disagreed with each of them. So if we look at the first statement at the top, so just under 1 in 5 young people agreed or agreed strongly that they felt anxious if they were unable to check social media or messaging apps regularly. And then looking at the next bar down, a similar proportion agreed that they cared about the number of likes or reposts or comments that their post received. Moving down again to the third bar, then you can see a slightly higher proportion, again, 28% agreed that seeing other people's social media posts sometimes made them feel worse about their own lives. So we do see a minority of young people reporting some negative experiences of using social media. On the other hand, it's also worth pointing out that more than half of young people disagreed with each of these statements, and also that more than 9 out of 10 agreed that social media helps them keep in touch with their friends. So including many of the young people who also felt social media sometimes made them feel worse about themselves. So there's definitely both some positives and some negatives on show here. Next slide, please. Yeah. So just like for kind of social media use, we saw some quite notable differences between young women and young men when it came to their kind of views and experiences of using social media. So we had 25% of young women who agreed they felt anxious when they weren't able to check social media or messaging apps regularly. And this was the case for just 11% of young men. Next slide, please. And yes, so for this one, we can see again, we've got 24% of young women agreed that they cared about how many likes or comments they received on their posts, but only 9% of young men agreed that this was the case for them. And another thing to say is that young men were also much more likely to say that they strongly disagreed with this. So 51% of young men said this, compared with just 22% of young women. And next slide, please. And again, young women were also much more likely to say that other people's social media posts sometimes made them feel worse about their own life. 41% compared with 13% of young men. And again, there was this kind of noticeable strength of feeling among young men. So we had 41% disagreeing strongly, and just 12% of young women doing so. So we've not got a chart for this, but young women were also a little bit more likely than young men to agree that social media helped them stay in touch with their friends. But just with figures above 90% for both men and women, the differences here were quite small, really, compared with the ones we've just seen for the other statements. But that was really all I was going to cover. So back to you, Paul.
Thanks very much. Lena, neat oversight of some of the social media data there. So we'll move on, and Helly Wilson is now going to present some of the key findings on political attitudes and civic participation. Helly.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so in Sweep 11, we asked both cohort members and their parents about their views and kind of engagement in political issues and politics in general. But we're just going to look at cohort members today. So when we're asking cohort members if they were registered to vote, you can see in the top graph that nearly 80% of young people were registered to vote. And then a further 10% were weren't registered but were planning on registering, and 11% weren't registered and weren't planning on registering either. Then the second chart here looks at who voted in the Scottish Parliament election in May 2021. So you can see that just over 0.5% had voted in the election in May 2021. Then a further 14% thought about voting, 26% didn't think about voting, and 2% were too young or weren't eligible at the time of the election. So next slide, we're just going to look at kind of some of the reasons why people said that they didn't vote in the Scottish Parliament election in 2021. So this is just of people who didn't vote. We asked them the reasons why. You can see that the most common reasons, because they weren't interested or didn't care about politics, followed by because they weren't registered in time to vote, or they didn't know about the election or forgot it was taking part that day. Just saying on this slide as well. So we've got a few differences by young men and women. So young women were more likely to say that they didn't know about the election, whereas young men were more likely to say that they weren't interested in politics or they didn't think it mattered who was elected. Okay, next slide. So now we asked all young people a few questions to kind of understand their perception of politics. So to start with, we asked them, how much of a difference do you think it makes to your own life who wins the elections to the Scottish Parliament? And looking at this chart at the top, so you can see that 38% thought it made either a great deal or quite a lot of difference to their life. 31% thought it made some difference, and 31% thought it made not very much difference or none at all. And then this bar chart at the bottom looks at the differences just in who said that who wins the election made not very much or no difference at all to their life. And you can see that this varies by sex and by area deprivation. So young men were, and those from the more deprived areas, were more likely to say that it didn't make very much difference or no difference at all to their life who won the Scottish Parliament elections. And then next slide. So we also asked to what extent people agreed with the statement, sometimes politics and government seem so complicated that a person like me can't really make sense of it all. And overall, we had over half of young people saying that they either strongly agreed or agreed with this, so 53%. 21% neither agreed nor disagreed, and then there was just 26% who disagreed or strongly disagreed with this statement. And this also varied by sex and area deprivation. So although in the previous slide we saw that women were more likely to say that politics made a difference to their life, they were also more likely to agree that sometimes politics can seem too complicated. So nearly 2/3 of women agreed with this statement compared to just 46% of men. And again, those in the two most deprived areas, quintiles, were more likely to agree with this than those in the least deprived areas. Okay. And then finally, another really interesting finding from Gus and this report was looking at how people get their news on government and politics. So we asked them within the last 12 months, what sources of information do you go to for news about government and politics? The most popular source of information used was social media, with 62%, nearly 2/3 of young people saying that that's how they, a source that they used. That was followed by TV programs and online news websites. And again, this did have some differences by gender. So notably, young women were more likely to use social media, whereas young men were more likely to use YouTube or to say that they'd not followed the news about about politics in Scotland in the last year. Young people in the most deprived areas were more likely to say that they'd not followed the news about politics in Scotland in the last year. And disabled young people were less likely to use social media than non-disabled young people to follow news about politics in Scotland in the last year.
Okay, thanks, Helly. So some really interesting and a little bit unique, some of that data for young people in Scotland on their political attitudes and civic participation. So great to have an overview of that. So we're just going to finish the topic sections with a brief overview of some of our findings on mental health and life satisfaction. So we've included a range of measures of mental health in the age 17 questionnaire, and we've got some measures of mental health and well-being and life satisfaction across a number of the sweeps for the reported by the young people. But at age 17, we measured depressive symptoms using the patient health questionnaire, anxiety using the general anxiety disorder assessment, and each of these measure symptoms and experiences in the 2 weeks prior to being surveyed. We also asked about doctor-diagnosed depression and severe anxiety, whether that had ever been diagnosed by a doctor, and also asked young people whether they had self-harmed since the last interview. So that's roughly in the period between the ages of 14 and 17. So we've got a summary of each of those 4 measures on the slide there. And what you can see is that on the whole, most young people have good mental well-being, but a significant minority report poor mental health across the various measures. So 28% reporting moderate to be severe depressive symptoms in the last 2 weeks. A similar proportion, 25%, moderate or severe anxiety in the last 2 weeks. 15% had ever been diagnosed by a doctor with depression or severe anxiety, and 1 in 5, so around 21%, said that they had self-harmed since the previous interview. But what this slide also shows quite starkly is that on each of these measures, young women were significantly more likely to report poorer mental health than young men. So that was twice as likely for depression and self-harm, and around 3 times more likely for anxiety and doctor-diagnosed depression or severe anxiety. The differences in sex are also seen in relation to life satisfaction. Now, this is a composite measure that we use where we have 4 items from the Student Life Satisfaction Scale, and we take the responses on the 4 items and sum them to create an overall life satisfaction score. And the graph shows the proportion of young people who score at or above average or below average. And what you can see is that young women were more likely to report below average life satisfaction than young men. So 52% of young women reporting below average life satisfaction compared with 41% of young men. And on this measure, we also see differences by area deprivation. I'm not showing these on the graph, but young people in the most deprived quintile were more likely to report a below average life satisfaction score than young people in the least deprived quintile, so about 53% in the most deprived compared with 42% in the least deprived. Encouragingly, most young people had done something to support their mental health in the period since their previous interview. So 58% had done at least one of the range of actions or activities that we asked them about. And you can see that full suite of activities on the graph there. And what you can also see is that speaking to a friend or family member was the most common action that young people reported. So 48% had done that. But some young people had also seen a medical profession and or spoken to teachers or counsellors at school, whereas much fewer had contacted a helpline or self-medicated. When asked if there was at least one adult that they trusted and could talk to if they had a problem, and we've seen that talking to someone is a key action that young people have done to support their mental health. The majority of young people said that this was completely true, and almost all of the rest said it was somewhat true. Only a very small proportion, so just around 5%, said this was not very or not at all true, suggesting that they had no trusted adults they could turn to. It's notable, and you can see this from the graph here, that whilst most disabled young people said there was at least one adult they trusted and could talk to, relative to non-disabled young people, they were less likely to say this was completely true and more likely to say it was somewhat true. So a subtle but potentially an important difference between disabled and non-disabled young people there. And again, yeah, talking to others, as I noted earlier, was something many young people had done to support their mental health. When asked who they would talk to when they were worried about something, more than half of young people said they would talk to their parents, and a similar proportion said they would talk to their friends. Around 1/4, though, said they would keep it to themselves. And this was much more common among young men than young women. And you can see that to the right-hand side of the graph there. So young men were almost twice as likely as young women to say this. And they were also less likely than young women to say they would talk to their parents or friends. So whilst young men report on the whole better mental health and well-being than young women, they are less likely to talk to someone if they do have concerns or need support. So yeah, that just concludes our whistle-stop tour of some of the key findings from the report. I hope that's given you some insight into some of the topics the study covered at age 17. If you do have questions for clarification, do put them into the Q&A. And if you're interested in finding out more information about the study, please look at the study website. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Twitter or X. Thank you for listening, and thank you to all our participants as well for giving up their time to take part and give us this really rich and valuable data set. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now and invite Donna Easterlow to make some comments on the findings from our Age 17 report. And many of you, I'm sure, will know Donna. She's Head of Children and Families Analysis at the Scottish Government. This division has responsibility for research, statistics and economic analysis to inform early years child protection, children's rights and well-being, early learning and childcare and school-age childcare policy. And GUS is managed by Donna's team, but with strong links across the whole of the government. You may know Donna from previous Scottish Government roles in rural, transport and constitutional reform analysis in Scottish Government. So Donna, yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks for that introduction. But firstly, I wanted to thank you and your team more widely for organising and delivering this webinar, and indeed for the delivery of SWEEP 11 of GUS most recently. And I just wanted to underline how important it is to showcase the wide findings of this sweep. And the presentations today have hopefully whetted the appetite of everybody listening in to go and read the full report to learn more of the detail and even wider breadth of the full findings. Age 17 is obviously a critical time in the lives of young people. We're referring to young people, rightly so, but of course this age puts the GUS participants at the very top end of what tends to still be thought of as childhood, including in official definitions such as for the purposes of children's rights and the UNCRC. So there's been some challenging and disappointing findings, I think, in what you've outlined, but some really positive ones too. And of course, we need to know them all, and as a government, use these findings to inform our policies. And while I've commented about the age 17 being a critical time at the kind of upper end of childhood, it's also, of course, an age central to the transition into adulthood. And that's an important time again in and of itself. And of course, we're looking forward to Sweep 12 findings too, when the same cohort will be that little bit older and a little bit further into adulthood. But I wanted to just pick up quickly on a couple of things from the presentations. I'm particularly interested to hear the findings on political and civic participation. I worked in electoral and constitutional reform at the time of the extension of the franchise in Scotland to 16 and 17-year-olds initially in the independence referendum voting. And just to say, it's obviously really critical that we're able to keep monitoring the political participation and engagement of young people. It feels like quite a while now since the franchise was extended, and it's not something that we should take for granted that young people will continue to be as engaged as we initially hoped for, and indeed as much as they were. And of course, variations between different groups, particularly different social groups, is really important for us to know more about. I also wanted to pick up on something that Eleanor mentioned about the kind of the difference in aspirations and experiences of disabled and non-disabled young people. And I wanted to flag in particular the National Transitions to Adulthood Strategy for Young Disabled People that Scottish Government published earlier this year in June, which aims to ensure that every young disabled person in Scotland feels confident in their transition to adulthood and is empowered and supported to control their own path to success. Interestingly, it focuses on young people aged 14 to 25. So for Sweep 11 and Sweep 12 participants, kind of in the middle of that, we had a sweep of 14-year-old people too. And I wanted to just highlight, in case people weren't aware of the particular commitment in the strategy, which was to undertake analysis of growing up in Scotland, to explore young people's lives in Scotland and their post-school outcomes and experiences across a range of life areas, with a commitment to further analysis and further research. So I wanted to highlight that in particular, because it's a specific commitment in the Scottish Government strategy to the use of growing up in Scotland, which I think highlights the recognition of Scottish Government to the really valuable data and information that growing up in Scotland provides to us to inform and monitor in terms of our policy making. And I want to finish then on a wider point about growing up in Scotland. So I'm sure, as everybody's aware, there's growing interest across the UK in longitudinal study. You might be aware of the new UK Generation New Era, and I know, Paul, you're involved with that. But then for us in Scottish Government and in Scotland, we're particularly pleased that we have growing up in Scotland, and that we have this amazingly rich data on a cohort of young people from their very earliest years, and that we're still currently adding to this. So while these findings of our GUST participants at age 17 are really important, useful and interesting in and of themselves, it's crucial to remember that we have the opportunity to explore how these young people got to where they are now, and to explore their life experiences along the way to understand better the lives, challenges, experiences and opportunities that they're experiencing now. So I'll finish there. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks very much, Donna. And of course, I mean, working on growing up in Scotland, it's not really like a job, it's more like a vocation. Right, I'm pleased to say that we've got lots of great questions. I've tried to answer a couple of quick ones whilst you were chatting there, but we've certainly got many more. I'll just start at the top with Gillian's question about how many children have moved away from Scotland, and do we still include them when that's the case? So yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, it's not a huge number, Gillian, but I'd say over the course of the entire study, it's probably somewhere around 10%, many to other parts of the UK. Before we were, because we traditionally collected data face to face, if they moved out of Scotland, we didn't follow them up. But at this wave, because we were inviting young people to complete online, anyone who lived anywhere could take part. But that's really a function only of the most recent sweep. Helen, maybe my fellow speakers could put their cameras on. Helen has got a question for Eleanor. Do the stats on what young people are doing break down in more detail? For example, the numbers who are at school, university, and also working.
Yes, so we don't have that information in the report at the moment, but the data is available. So because we do ask about whether they're working and whether they're at school. So yeah, definitely there and able to be worked out. So
okay, great. Thank you, Eleanor, and thanks, Helen, for the question. Aisling, one of our colleagues involved in delivery of Growing Up in Ireland study. One for you, Lena, maybe. Only 17% caring about the number of likes, etc. on their social media posts seems a bit low.
I mean, I'm not sure what to say to that one, Aisling. I can reassure you, this was asked in a self-completion section of the survey. I think for me, it was a bit interesting, this kind of strength of feeling amongst young men that they definitely disagreed with some of these statements. And amongst young men, it was only 10%, I think, of the one you flagged. It was higher for young women. So I'm not sure what's going on there. I don't know if anybody else has some thoughts of that.
Yeah, I think maybe if I recall correctly, when we were developing the questionnaire for Sweep 12, and we did some kind of focus group consultations. Now that's the kids, the young people are slightly older, but there was a real sense that we picked up that they were getting a bit burnt out with social media, and I wonder if we just picked up a little bit of that at the age 17 sweep as well. It was just becoming less important to them. But yeah, I'm not sure what we can say beyond that. Thanks, Lena. Ali Wendy, great you were able to join. To what extent were these outcomes what you had anticipated? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think to some extent they were in places, but there were certainly some findings, particularly in some of the differences we saw by sex, and some of those we've talked about today. Some of the differences, particularly we found between disabled and non-disabled young people, and disability we measured through a standard question on experience of long-term health conditions and disabilities that we've used for a long time, we use across a number of studies, were probably more stark than we might have expected at this age. So yes, some anticipated. But yeah, I think some more stark and surprising and a little disappointing, I suppose, and disheartening in places, but lots of positives actually to take away as well. Anybody else want to offer a view on that? No. Joan, were you able to ascertain why young women were more likely to report poorer mental health and life satisfaction than young men? Accepting that the responses to social media questions may have some bearing on this. Yes, certainly it looks like there could be an association between social media use and mental well-being, but that is not something that thus far we've looked at, and it's not looked at in the report. But Joan, the data is very ripe for exploring those sorts of associations and trying to understand more about why those differences exist. And we look forward to colleagues utilising the data for that purpose. Kate, interested to know about your team's data collection challenges and capacity following up this many young people by interview. How many researchers work on this full time? How many attempts does it tend to take to arrange an interview? Thanks. Kate, great question. And good to have a question on the methodology and survey and data collection. So we had around 60 interviewers work on this sweep. We had a little over half of our, oh no, wait a minute, actually, sweep 11, yeah, it would have been about 60. It takes a lot of attempts. I think probably on average somewhere around 6 or 7 calls at the address to get an interview, and those calls need to be spread across different days of the week, different times of day, evenings, weekends, and so on. Lots of effort involved, but we do have as an agency, a research agency, a kind of panel of specialist field interviewers who work across this and other studies that we have in field, and we benefit greatly from that expertise that they bring. Daniela, could you say a bit about the perceived effect? This one's for you, Eleanor, I think. Could you say a bit about the perceived effect of the pandemic on this cohort's education experiences, sense of connection, participation, and outlook for the future? Do they feel the pandemic has impacted their experiences significantly, for example, in relation to mental health, or would they say they have moved on and these findings are not necessarily linked to the pandemic and its effects? Eleanor, do you think you could say something about that?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So we did ask about how they felt about the pandemic in terms of their education and how worried they were about the future. So whether that was the impact on their qualifications or on their job prospects. So we did find, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I did write a blog recently on the GUS website about some of those findings, and linking that to some of the UK COVID inquiry findings as well, about how young people were experiencing education sort of during and just after COVID. I can't speak to the mental health impact though. Don't know if you have anything on that, Paul.
Okay, no, I think we didn't look specifically at relationship between their views. You know, they had these questions about their level of optimism following the pandemic, and you could look at correlations between their views on that and mental health, but it's not something we've done in the report or in the data so far. But yeah, definitely lots of potential to explore COVID impacts across, and Eleanor's done that to some extent, and please check out our blog, it's on the GUS website, but definitely potential to explore it in relation to a number of other outcomes as well. Kate and Emily asking about the tracking experiences of young people over time. Yes, that is possible. We have a lot of repeat items. If they're not identical items, you can certainly harmonize outcomes across multiple waves and look at trajectories of different outcomes and experiences. That's not something that's been done in this report. It is purely cross-sectional, so we're only considering the age 17 data, but that is certainly something that's feasible to do. Will there be another sweep after sweep 12 to capture this for researchers? So this is a question about men maturing around 21 years old. Will there be another sweep after sweep 12? At the moment, there is nothing planned. But yeah, there is a possibility that there'll be a further sweep that will allow us to look at that. Thanks for that question. Yeah, that one is on. So Ali and Wendy is asking about correlations between early experience and later outcomes. Yeah, Ali and Wendy, undoubtedly there will be some correlations, but that's not something that has been looked at in relation to this most recent set of data that's available, the age 17 outcomes. But yeah, we would really hope that people will take the opportunity to explore those relationships now that that sort of full birth to the end of education data set is now available. Yeah, continue following the cohort. I've answered that one, I think. Aspects of preschool, yeah, so we've not done that yet in terms of looking at the association between aspects of preschool and this most recent set of outcomes, but certainly there are other reports that look at relationships between that very early period and outcomes in kind of early adolescence thus far. The binary male-female differentiation, was it problematic for this age group in the survey? So the results that we presented are results by sex, but actually we've got a gender identity question as well. So we were able to allow young people to report their gender identity as well as collecting their sex at birth, which obviously we've got historically on the data. So yeah, it wasn't particularly problematic because we were able to ask them and give them the opportunity to report their gender identity. And just a few more. Within these statistics, have there been further investigation into looked after children as well as between sex? So Sarah, thanks for that. And that's a question that comes up quite a lot in relation to Gus. And in fact, Donna and I were just exchanging some emails on this just yesterday. So unfortunately, the number of looked after children in the cohort isn't large enough to separate them out for separate analysis. Although we didn't look to exclude them from the research when they become looked after, particularly if they become looked after away from home, it becomes very difficult to track them in a general population study like this. And as such, we tend to lose them from the cohort over time, and so there just isn't sufficient numbers to do that analysis, I'm afraid. Any questions about civic participation other than voting, Helly?
Yes, we did also ask a question which asks if people have done kind of any other ways of kind of expressing their political views, which had a list of things like, buying or refusing to buy products or attending protests or giving money to campaigns. And then there were kind of more general questions about whether people were taking any political subjects at school or talking to their friends or family about politics. And that's all included in the report as well.
Great, thanks, Helly. And then a final one from Miles. Did you collect any data on other demographics of the young people, e.g. ethnic groups? Yes, Miles, ethnicity is there. There's a religion variable, a whole host of background socioeconomic characteristics as well. And obviously historically, that is collected and updated throughout the course of the study. Anything on volunteering as a form of civic participation as the last one, Helly?
It's not one of the options in that list. There's giving money to a campaign or organisation. Not sure if it was a question more generally about volunteering.
Lena?
Yeah, we ask it in a different section. We ask young people about activities they do, and one of them's about volunteering.
Great. Thank you, and thanks for the question, Susan. Okay, we're out of time. Thanks very much to those of you who have hung around. I really hope that you've enjoyed that today. Thanks to each of my speakers, Eleanor, Lena, Helly, and also thanks to Donna as well. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thanks very much. Bye.